Vice Chair of Economic Development for the Greater Oklahoma City Chamber, David Rainbolt.
Good morning and welcome to the second annual State of the Economy event put on by the Oklahoma City Chamber. Today's event was created in response to feedback from you that information about the economy is something that you want the Chamber to provide to you. Today we hope to give you an insight to the coming months, looking at both opportunity and uncertainty. As we read again today in the newspaper, our local economy continues to show strength, even as the national economy struggles a bit. We also are well aware that Congress and the administration have the potential to tip the balance of both. Estimates indicate that our 7-county region will end 2012 on a positive note. Total non-farm employment will have increased by 15,000 plus jobs, almost 16,000, a 2.7% increase over last year. Importantly, that's almost double the employment growth rate of the rest of the nation. It's no surprise that the largest job gains came from energy and the professional services and retail trade that are driven by it. Each of these sectors enjoyed over 7% growth. Job declines of 4 to 6% occurred in the information services and construction industries. The net effect still leaves Oklahoma City in the top 10 in all metro regions in terms of percentage growth over the past 2 years. In 2012, as part of the Forward Oklahoma City Economic Development Campaign, Chamber-assisted companies have added 2,600 jobs, $106 million in payroll, and $357 million in capital investment. However, this success lies in the shadow of national political and economic uncertainty. Nationwide, companies have been reluctant to pull the trigger on announcing projects and relocating to new markets. Even here in Oklahoma City, we've been impacted by this. The job and capital and investment growth that we saw in 2012 was primarily from expansion of existing businesses, and there were relatively few new market announcements. The Chamber's strategy continues to be focused on economic development efforts on our key industry sectors of aerospace, bioscience, energy, advanced manufacturing, and logistics and distribution. As evidenced by the fact that Oklahoma City Metro has enjoyed the lowest unemployment rate among large metros for, as we read this morning, 18 out of the past 22 months, and which is a huge positive. As you can imagine, it's nonetheless a challenge in that we have to continue to improve our standard of living to attract new talent. For Oklahoma City, preliminary forecasts for 2013 indicate that the region will experience 2.3% growth, a little less than this year, and add 13,500 new jobs. However, anticipated job growth in 2013 is dependent upon Congress and the President finding common grounds in terms of the proposed budget and spending plans. The economic trends we discussed today will undoubtedly influence each of our day-to-day businesses. Today we'll hear from a local panel of economists as well as a respected national forecaster. However, before they speak, I'd like to invite today's signature sponsor, Arvest Bank, to make a few comments. And so if you would, please welcome EVP and Regional Manager for Arvest, Brad Krieger.
Good morning. On behalf of Arvest Bank, we certainly appreciate you allowing us to be the signature sponsor for the second year in a row for this event. We thank all of you that are attending today, and it's wonderful to see that today's event has almost double the amount of people that we had a year ago. It speaks to the support of this community. Certainly the last 4 years have provided some challenges and opportunities, yet during this time, Oklahoma City and the state have gained attention not only nationally, but abroad. It has a momentum that is grounded in an attitude of can-do, as well as fiscal prudence. Today we hear about the fiscal cliff, debt ceilings, and the effects of the global environment, which leads to a certain amount of paralysis due to what David had mentioned earlier, uncertainty. We look forward to hearing from Dr. Asmus as well as the distinguished panel for their outlook and also looking for solutions. But again, thanks again for being here, and do enjoy today's program.
Thanks again, Brad. We appreciate Arvest doing this for us. You know, last night I had dinner with our panelists, our feature speaker, Dr. Larkin Warner, and Eric Long as well. In all, that's 7 economists. I have to say, it was one of the most stimulating dinner conversations I've had in a long while, and I'm not kidding. Now, that could mean a couple of things. I have a pathetic social life, or you all are in for a treat today. And I really think it means both. So I'll introduce the panelists, and that'll be followed with some pre-printed Q&A, and then you all will have a chance to follow on with questions after that. But as I introduce each panelist, if you guys would come on up and get in your chair. Our first panelist is the Director for the Center of Economic and Management Research at the University of Oklahoma. Please welcome, if you would, Dr. Robert Dauffenbach. And Russell, you might start walking a little earlier. I think you're halfway back in the room. Also joining us is Executive Director of the Stephen C. Agee Economic Research and Policy Institute at OCU. Please welcome Russell Evans. Our next panelist is the Dean for the University of Central Oklahoma Business School. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mickey Hepner. Our final panelist is the Regents Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for Applied Economic Research at Oklahoma State University, Dr. Dan Rickman. All right. Okay, guys, we all comfortable, like we're sitting in our living rooms talking about economics? I think on everybody's mind is the fiscal cliff, and so the first question, we'll jump right into that. Every day brings the country closer to reaching the $16 trillion debt limit. The Democrats and Republicans continue to play the game of fiscal chicken. We hear a lot about the impending fiscal cliff and sequestration. Will Congress reach a compromise? And if so, how would you see the likely agreement impacting the Oklahoma economy? Russell, I think that's you.
Sure. So I have to admit that I don't talk economics in my living room very often. My wife tends to not allow that, so this would be a nice change. When we talk about the fiscal cliff, we're really talking about 2 components here. The one component being the expiration of the Bush-era tax cuts, and the other component being the sequestration that was agreed to in the 2011 debt ceiling negotiations. And so what sequestration is, and really it dates back to the Balanced Budget and Deficit Control Act of 1985, is the idea that if Congress appropriates more money above and beyond some cap, the difference between the appropriations and the cap are then sequestered or set aside and some sort of a blanket or uniform across-the-board cut of programs that don't qualify as exempt programs. So as part of the 2011 debt ceiling negotiations, Congress agreed that, that they would find $1.2 trillion worth of cuts over the next 10 years, about $110 billion in this upcoming fiscal year. And that they would find these cuts, and if they didn't, that the monies would be sequestered, would be set aside and cut out of these non-exempt programs. So if you think about the federal budget is about $3.6 trillion. Of that $3.6 trillion, about $2.6 trillion is exempt from sequestration, which leaves about $1 trillion of programs and spending that qualify for the sequestration. So you're talking about $110 billion out of $1 trillion. You're talking about basically a 10% cut across the board of some of these programs. Okay? Some programs slightly more, slightly less. For Oklahoma, this would be about, I think our biggest concern in Oklahoma would be, this would mean about a $55 billion cut in defense spending. This would mean the other portion of the $110 billion, the other $45 billion would come from farm subsidies, cuts in federal education spending, cuts in community block grants, cuts in vocational and rehabilitation programs, and other non-exempt programs. So this does leave Oklahoma open to the possibility of some pretty significant defense spending cuts. Particularly central Oklahoma with Tinker and the FAA Center and a heavy reliance on federal civilian and military defense spending, it leaves open the possibility that those cuts could be damaging to the economic growth and the power that we have going forward. Now, all that said, I think you're safe to forget all those numbers as fast as I just said them, right? So if you didn't catch those numbers, I think you can forget them as fast as I said them, because it's almost inconceivable to think that some sort of a deal would not be struck. Right? Nobody wants the full expiration of the Bush-era tax credits. Nobody wants the full sequestration of the $110 billion. It's almost inconceivable to think that some sort of deal wouldn't be struck. In 2011, as this deal was being put on the table, I was in Washington, D.C. I was in unrelated meetings, but all anybody wanted to talk about was the debt ceiling. And we were told by every member of Congress that we went and visited with that day, as they talked about the debt ceiling, that this was a meaningless sort of artificial crisis that was being created because there was no way that Congress or the Senate would ever allow these sorts of defense spending cuts to occur. And so I continue to operate on the assumption that some sort of a resolution will be reached. I suspect that resolution will include extending all of the Bush-era tax cuts except for those in the top 2%. I suspect there will be some sort of a deal on some spending cuts. We won't get the full $110 billion, but we'll avoid the sequestration. And that's sort of the baseline that we're going forward as we build our economic outlook. The last comment I'll make, the one thing I do take away from this is it is disconcerting to me that in order for Congress to feel like they can approach a fiscal spending, a debt issue that is an ongoing issue, that they have to artificially manufacture a crisis in order for them to function at any level whatsoever, right? And so we had to put the crisis in place to get any level of functioning at all whatsoever, and I think we still won't get a very high level of functioning. And I don't think that speaks well for going forward, the possibility of well thought out, well discussed, openly engaged policies as we go forward and try to tackle deficit and debt spending issues. I think to me, that's the takeaway that I'm still not sold that we're moving in the right direction in terms of how we interact in Washington, D.C. on such an important issue.
I would say the culture of hyper-partisanship is clearly a problem. It was like 2 decades ago when we were faced with an environmental crisis. Republican President George Herbert Walker Bush proposed a cap-and-trade bill to stop or stem the amount of sulfur dioxide emissions that produce acid rain. And more than 90% of the House members, Democrats and Republicans, came together, rallied around, and passed the bill. More than 90% of the senators came together, rallied around, Democrats and Republicans, and passed the bill. That was only 2 decades ago. But it's hard to imagine anything like that ever happening with environmental legislation, with budget legislation, to have that kind of bipartisan compromise at work when compromise has become such a dirty word. I think the issue that we have here is that we've forgotten that America works best when Americans work together. And until we get that sense that we are better off together, that we can reach across the aisle to good-intentioned, well-intentioned, kind people who may just have a different set of preferences than we do, and find an agreement, to find common ground, to move us forward. Until we reach that point with the leaders in Congress, it's going to be hard for us to make significant progress on any of these tough issues. Last year, they made a deal, as Russ mentioned, when we were faced with the debt ceiling crisis. Well, let's keep in mind that deal came after lots of wrangling, after lots of threats, came after a debt downgrade by the S&P, and a drop in consumer confidence that resulted after all those discussions. So until we get past this culture of conflict and towards this recognition that we are all in this together, it's going to be hard for us to have a meaningful solution that looks well into the future.
Okay. Personal income tax. A year ago, this panelist group was one of the first to publicly discuss the possible impact of eliminating the personal income tax here in Oklahoma. Governor Fallin continues to support a program to reduce and possibly eliminate personal income tax in the long run. If implemented, how do you think this plan will affect the state and specifically the city?
Well, this is, again, an issue of intense discussion this last year. At this panel last year, we talked about it, and I said I vigorously oppose any proposal to eliminate the state's personal income tax, mainly because it generates 40% of our state's general revenue, and we really haven't come up with any discussions about how we're going to replace that lost revenue. Some people say we don't have to really replace it, but we're talking about $2 billion, and you can't go without that extra $2 billion of revenue unless you want to make significant cuts to education, to health care, to roads, to prisons. And so when you make those kind of transformational changes, those come with tough choices. And until we're ready to make those tough choices about what we want to give up, what else we want to tax, then making those kind of transformational changes in the tax structure is really going to be impossible. The only alternative, if you eliminate the income tax, is to spend less on education, health care, roads, and prisons, or to tax other things. We have an income tax that's below the national average in the amount of its incidence. We have a sales tax at the state and local level that's above the national average. That negatively impacts our cities right now. And so it makes you wonder, I would argue that the sales tax is a much more pressing problem, especially for our cities, than the income tax is. But you also have other issues at work as well. We rank as a state 49th in the nation in per pupil education funding in K through 12. We have health care that, healthcare needs and healthcare problems in the state, relatively high level of healthcare costs here in Oklahoma. We have roads and bridges that are routinely ranked among the nation's worst. And so we have a number of issues that we need to address. And I would argue that eliminating the income tax actually keeps us from doing those things that make this state a more attractive place, to make it a place where executives and leaders want to come and want to raise their children and their families.
Yes, I completely agree with Mickey. I think if you look at this, there are two sides to this equation. There's revenue and there's expenditures. And if you're going to cut revenues, you have to cut expenditures. There isn't a silver bullet in terms of magic growth. There is not any empirical evidence to support that. So then you have to start talking about, well, what things do you want to cut? And the empirical evidence on that suggests that roads and bridges and the like are very important for business location and for households. Education is very important. The other thing that I would add is, given how much we hear how Texas should be our economic model, so I've been spending a lot of time since last year looking at this, and it's very difficult to come up with any evidence to suggest that Texas is outperforming Oklahoma. If you look at it at the state level, you look at the county level, you look at counties along the border, you slice it every which way you want, different economic indicators. I just cannot find evidence that suggests to me that Texas is outperforming Oklahoma. Which suggests to me then that we shouldn't necessarily be grabbing on so tightly to their economic model if we can't see that they're outperforming us. That really there is more evidence in terms of these other sides, in terms of expenditures that may be of value.
I'd just like to say Larkin Warner and I entered the fray with our fellow economists in the state opposed to elimination of the state income tax last year, and Larkin and I studied this issue and even got an academic publication out of it, and we were exploring essentially to the extent the state has already reduced taxes substantially. When you go from a 7% rate, and this is arithmetic, You go from a 7% tax rate to a 5.5% income tax rate. Well, you say, well, that's only a reduction of 1.5 percentage points. No, it's a reduction of 1.5 over 7, which works out to be a 25 or nearly a 20. Well, I think we went down like 1.75%. I'm trying to remember exactly, but it worked out to be almost a 25% reduction in your revenues from that source. So you're looking at so you take a percentage point off the tax rate, you get a much larger impact on your revenues. And frankly, we'd done a lot in the years 2000s, the decade of 2000 to 2010, to reduce our tax burden at the state level. And in fact, our study showed that we knocked in the neighborhood of $2 billion out of our revenue stream. So we've already done a lot, and we really need to be careful about what else we do, because we're starting to really cut into the marrow of our programs.
Yeah, I just a final comment building on Dan's comment. When you look at the empirical evidence of what drives business expansion and business location, when you ask businesses if they like low taxes or do they like roads and bridges, do they like high educational attainment, the answer is always yes, right? I like both. I like low taxes and I like the educational attainment. I like the roads and bridges. I like the infrastructure. And I think for questions like this, there's not a right or wrong answer in terms of what Oklahoma's tax system and spending priorities should look like. I mean, it's very much a reflection of individual preferences and societal preferences. I think for questions like this, it's particularly important in an organization like this, like you in attendance today, contemplate and speak within your organizations and to each other about where do we stand in the state and what do you feel like drives your expansion and would drive further expansion of the state economy. Is it cutting tax rates? Or is it not cutting tax rates or even increasing tax rates but offering more educational attainment or roads and bridges infrastructure? Where do we stand right now in terms of our balance of tax burden and infrastructure development? Which do we need more of, and what's our individual trade-off? I think it's an important question for bodies like this to address and then take to policymakers and say, this is kind of our sense of where things stand. Here's what we would like to see. And I think you get much better policy that way than the alternative.
Now, you all heard the unanimity of that. I got a feeling amongst 900 people there's somebody out there that might disagree with that, so we're getting your question together. A recent Wall Street Journal article referenced a study indicating that the recent shale oil boom will help the United States overtake Saudi Arabia as the world's largest oil producer by 2020. Based on these estimates by the International Energy Agency, will current energy policies allow this to occur? And if this does happen, how will the interplay between a continuation of rapid energy development and sizable increases in supplies impact both the nation and the Oklahoma economy? Russell?
Yeah, so the energy industry continues to play an important role in Oklahoma. Accounts for 80 to 90,000 jobs across the state. A lot of those self-employed and very small independent producer jobs. It continues to be very closely linked into the state's manufacturing activities and other business activities, and so you see these spillover effects into other industries. And at the end of the day, still accounts for the lion's share of our state's gross domestic product and personal income and employment by the time you account for all these multiplier or spillover effects. What's changing the energy industry right now is really the occupational mix. If you look inside an energy company right now, it looks very different than it did 20 years ago. We're seeing much more emphasis on environmental controls and regulatory experts, accountants, computer science, quantitative needs inside the buildings. And so you see the geologists, the engineers you would expect to see, but you also see these other occupations. And I think that it will continue to be the cornerstone of Oklahoma's economy going forward. As you think about the development of these energy sources, these shale plays, you really have two dynamics going on. You have, on the one hand, Brazil and India and China that should offer up a huge demand for energy going forward because they have tremendous growth still ahead of them. At the same time, you have countries like Brazil that have their own tremendous, huge offshore oil reserves. And so we'll continue to develop new fields and we'll have this interaction of the supply and global demand. I really think that what we'll see going forward, and particularly on the natural gas front and even on the oil front, is we'll see prices trade in a much smaller bandwidth. I think we'll see less volatility, see some occasional volatility, but I'm looking for a much tighter bandwidth in terms of trading prices, and the paradigm really shifting to one of optimal extraction. The question is when gas prices get to $3.75, where they're at right now, or $4 or $4.25, can companies find ways to innovate and extract and earn their 7 or 8% return at that low price? And if I can find a way to get my 7 or 8 or 9% return on $3.75 or $4 gas, then I think we'll continue to extract, and it bodes very well for Oklahoma. And this is sort of my internal perspective. Is I just think going forward that's what we'll see. I think we'll continue to see an energy-led economy here in Oklahoma. I think we'll see less volatility in prices, and it really becomes one of optimal extraction that feeds an ongoing economic activity in Oklahoma.
I would just take a longer-term look at the energy industry, and if we think about where Oklahoma is positioned, we've historically been an energy-producing state and been positioned well, but I think if we look future, I think we're even better positioned, if that's possible, going forward, because there will be an increasing push, whether we like it or not, for governments around the world to address climate change. An increasing push in Europe, an increasing push within the United States. We've seen that within both parties, even just since the election, an increasing push, especially on the coast, for governments to adopt policies that address climate change. And if we think about fuels that respond well in that kind of environment, you think about natural gas. You think about natural gas generates 1/2 the greenhouse gas emissions that coal generates, the energy source we typically use to power our homes. Compressed natural gas generates 30% fewer greenhouse gas emissions than the gasoline we use to typically power our cars. It is a cleaner fuel. And while the price has been depressed for a while, that movement, that push, longer term, over the next few decades, will produce, in addition to the increase in growth and demand from the developing countries, will produce even greater upward pressure on prices, supporting the Oklahoma economy going forward. I just think we're uniquely positioned in a greener world to serve the energy needs of that future as well.
Okay, Dan, on the topic of poverty, during fiscal year 2011, there were an estimated 600,000 Oklahomans receiving food stamps. This was the case even though our unemployment rate was among the lowest in the nation. What do you see as the prospect for the incidence of poverty to fall significantly in Oklahoma going forward?
Well, that's always an interesting question, because usually we presume when we're getting some economic growth that we're going to see reductions in poverty, and that everybody may necessarily benefit from this. But it's not always necessarily the case. And the poverty rate is indeed really tied closely to the employment rate, which actually embodies changes in labor force participation and the unemployment rate. So if you get changes in the unemployment rate, you will tend to see reductions in the poverty rate. But there are complications that come with that. One is that there's kind of a skills bifurcation going on in the U.S. right now. If you look over the last decade, that the fastest growing jobs were either at the really top end of the distribution of skills and education and at the very bottom. And the slowest growth were in occupations in the middle. And so this sort of bodes poorly in terms of getting people at the bottom to be moving them up, even if you have growth. Also, one of the things the last few years in Oklahoma, we've had a pretty robust migration from other states. And particularly, we're coming from states that were hard hit by the bursting of the housing bubble. That provides competition for those who are already here living in a state who would like to take some of those jobs and move up with the growth. So they potentially can be at a disadvantage because of that competition. So the way that we're going to really have to get the people sort of at the bottom up, being connected with the growth, is if they have the skills and education. If they don't, just simple employment growth alone won't do it. And particularly, there's a geographic component. There's regions in the state that have much higher poverty rates than others. And those regions have had higher poverty for a very long time. They have very sluggish growth, very poor economic outcomes. And unless we turn around some of those areas, they figure into the overall average for the state. It's going to be difficult to move the whole state average downwardly unless we kind of address those regions. And that's tricky. I mean, and people who study this, that's not only an education side, there's an economic development side. So you sort of have to address the education, training, at the same time you're trying to stimulate those local economies. And it takes a fairly holistic approach to take that on. So I'm hopeful that gains can be made, but there's really a lot of challenges for us to bring the poverty rate down, even while we grow.
I'm just going to say that when you look at Oklahoma, if you look back to, like, say, 1970, just go back 35, 40 years, you would find that in Oklahoma County and in almost any rural county in the state, you would find that the per capita personal incomes were relatively similar. So 35 or 40 years ago, you would have a similar economic reality across urban and rural areas. And you fast forward now, and the per capita personal income in Oklahoma County, depending on the rural county you pick, is 150 to 180% of the per capita income in those rural counties. And so you see a different economic reality beginning to manifest itself in urban areas over rural areas. If you looked at the same time period, you would find that in almost any one of those rural counties that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, transfer payments, income subsidies made up about 8 or 9% of personal income. Now they make up 17, 18% of personal income. And so you've really seen in the last 30 or 40 years a very different economic reality manifest itself in amenity-rich, high-productive urban centers from the economic reality that's manifesting itself in amenity-deficient, less productive rural areas. And as Dan alluded to, I think those are some very difficult challenges to overcome. And I don't know what the prospects are for finding ways to reach out into some of those rural, persistent, high-poverty areas, and what they would need to do to develop the sorts of amenities or productivity gains in order to grow out of those poverty stages. But you're really seeing two different economic realities over the last 35 years, different than what we've seen previous to that. We talk about the world being flat, but the world's not nearly as flat as we think. Right? There's a different economic reality in high amenity, high productive urban areas than there is in rural areas, and how we bridge that gap, I don't know, but it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a difficult challenge to overcome.
How do we address poverty, improve the lives of people? From a policy perspective, there have been a couple of decisions made in the last couple of years, especially one in the last few weeks, that would have significantly improved or increased or enhanced the quality of life of some people struggling, living day to day, week to week, while providing immense economic benefits to the state. Just in the last couple of weeks, Governor Fallin declined to expand the state's Medicaid program. It was an option that was available under the Affordable Care Act. It was an expansion of the Medicaid program to allow adults up to the 133% of the poverty level to enroll in Medicaid. And that incredible opportunity for them to have access to the health insurance that they would want and need. From the government's perspective, the federal government would have picked up 100% of the cost of that expansion, essentially free money coming to the state for 3 years. The amount of the federal match would have declined over the next several years. By 2020, the federal government would be picking up 90% of the cost. Literally, over that span of time, billions of extra dollars flowing into the state, going to providers. Those providers have higher incomes. Those providers pay higher taxes, buy more stuff, pay higher sales taxes. Additional economic money, additional wealth being created just by offering to help a group of people who are struggling financially. For a variety of reasons, the governor decided not to participate in the state, and I think from the anti-poverty perspective, that was a mistake. From an economic development perspective, I think it was an incredible mistake. The Healthcare Association, a strong advocate for accepting those federal dollars. We're talking about a $50 million investment a year in providing health care for people, getting $500 million in extra federal funds coming in each year. Incredible return, and I think as a banker, if you could get a 10-to-1 match on your money within a year, that's a pretty good deal to take. It's certainly a lot better than what the Federal Reserve is giving out right now. And so it was an incredible opportunity that was just wasted, again, to provide billions of dollars of extra income and funds flowing into Oklahoma. And as a result, Oklahoma is poorer by not adopting that anti-poverty measure.
And Mickey, I don't disagree with you, but just from an academic point of view, I am curious. If you look at it in a vacuum, you've got all the things you said, all the stimulus that you mentioned coming into the state. Would you postulate that if we had to pay for it the day we expanded Medicare, the money that comes out of the system is less productive than the money that would come into the system that you talked about. I mean, what about the interplay if we really had to pay for it? I understand what you're saying. If Oklahoma doesn't do it and everybody else does it, I get that. But what if we really did have to pay for it?
Well, I mean, what if the federal money didn't come in?
No, what if for the federal money to come in, the federal government had to collect that same amount of money from all of us?
I'm still not following.
Balanced budget.
Oh, well. You know.
I know it's hypothetical. Maybe even a dream sequence, but.
The federal government, do they know they can do that? Do they know that? Yeah.
It's just an academic question.
Yeah, it's a, you know, that brings a different issue here because the way for the states, the benefit to the states here is the federal match, right? And from Oklahoma's perspective, it would still be a win for us because we pay less in federal taxes than we actually get back from the federal government. It would not be a win for the wealthier states, but because of our relatively high level of uninsured people, because of the relatively low incomes in Oklahoma, it would still be a net benefit for us. The rest of the nation would be subsidizing us. In this case, what's going on now with Congress committing to provide these funds, we've just turned away money that could have provided literally billions of dollars of additional wealth growth in this state over the next 10 years.
Okay, what we're all very curious about is sustainability of the success we've enjoyed the last several years. Oklahoma City metro area has been in the top 10 for job growth over the last 2 years. We know energy's been a big part of our success. So the question is, are we just in some kind of extended energy boom, or is there more to it? What can we do to sustain the success we've had?
Well, thank you. We've been giving these questions ahead of time that I give my students questions on the exam ahead of time too, but it doesn't often help. So. But I did get this question last night and was told to speak to it, and I really feel passionate about it because I think we have something here in Oklahoma City that we're not really all that fully appreciative of, and we should be. Actually, a gathering like this is a statement in itself. But I go back to the time that I went 21 years ago to went from OSU to OU. So I'm an ecumenical kind of guy. I married a Catholic, so I'm just a very even-handed kind of guy. But at that time, the real together community in the state was Tulsa. And Oklahoma City was just kind of getting its act together under the vision and leadership of Mayor Norick. What was done in the city in the MAPS program for education for the downtown area, this seeds being sowed those 20 years ago are just paying handsome dividends today. And it's the vision and leadership that came out of that time, and Oklahoma City pulled it together, and Tulsa seems to have lost it for some reason. So we have a real delving into political economy here that I don't know much about, but there's something that's going on in this community that keeps it together that I think is going to lead to a very sustainable future if we keep it together, and I think we can. Public investment, I don't know if there's a pure example of public investment preceding private investment than we have in the downtown Oklahoma City area. Larkin's done considerable research on this, and on the MAPS programs even written a book. So it's something that we've studied, and I think we need to certainly recognize that something magical has happened here in the last 20 years, and we need to examine that and understand it better so that we can lay the seeds for the next 20 years. Now, when we look at the industrial structure of industry employment patterns in Oklahoma City, we certainly see that we are indeed the corporate headquarters for the natural gas industry in the world. And you know, we're not just talking about drilling in Oklahoma here, we're talking about drilling in North Dakota and Pennsylvania and all around the country, which that production function is all organized and controlled centrally here in Oklahoma City with great impact and great plume. But I think obviously we recognize other aspects of Oklahoma City that have grown and are important to the area, and one of these is healthcare. And you just have to applaud what David Bourne and the state has done, and the leadership of the Health Sciences Center, Joseph Ferretti, the provost up there for many years, and what they've built and how that operation has come together and flourished. The Oklahoma City area, you know, the not good news part about it is that we've lost 20,000 jobs from our peak in the year 2000 in manufacturing. We've gained 20,000 in the health industry. And we all know about the pig going through the python, and that's the baby boomer generation, and we've seen tremendous growth in health services even before we're substantially in need of medical service, and I'm leading edge of the baby boomers. I was born in 1946, so I know that crest of that wave is yet to come to us. I think we need to recognize as well that another good industry to be in is national defense, and what we have in Tinker is a considerable employment base in the area, and we've always done well in the BRAC competitions. We've added jobs to the area as a consequence of base closings in other locations, and I think that we certainly need to recognize that, for example, in Oklahoma City has a 4% differential in private, in federal employment, civilian employment, 4% differential with Tulsa, and that's 20,000 jobs, just civilian jobs right there, and then not counting the military jobs there. So that's something we have to keep in mind, and I think the Defense Department likes Oklahoma because we're a good value in comparison to many other locations, and so we need to keep that up. So the answer is yes. I think we have a very sustainable growth path here. In the future, we need to pay attention to education and our future workforce needs. But I'm very optimistic about this city and very appreciative of the leadership that we've had in the past and continue. And so let's look for that next 20 years, how we position ourselves for that future.
Must have hit it out of the park if they're not saying anything to that. Well said. Okay, now's the time that we'll be taking questions from the audience. There are chamber staffers wandering about with microphones, so if you have a question, if you would raise your hand and catch their attention. Questions? Question in the back.
Could you please address the upcoming tax cuts that are as a result of the Affordable Care Act, or better known as Obamacare, that take effect January 1?
Yeah, let's restate the question. Make sure I ask this the way you intended it. You say, talk about the upcoming tax increases that will attend the elimination of the Bush tax cuts. Is that what we're talking about? Okay.
So I'll buy the other three some time while they think of a good answer.
We appreciate that.
So without addressing the impact of the tax increases in particular, but I would go back and talk about the Affordable Care Act just a little bit. I think, one of the things you see with sweeping social policy changes, when you talk to people who support changes to the current Social Security system, many people who support modest changes to the system acknowledge that if they could go back today and create a new system, they would start with a completely different Social Security system. But given that this is the system in place, going forward, they would address it with modest changes to the existing system. I think there's a tremendous amount of unknowns associated with what health care will look like in the United States 20 years from now, 25 years from now. I think there is an incentive on behalf of states like Oklahoma and Governor Fallon and other states to recognize the role that inertia plays in maintaining social policy and to be hesitant in expanding Medicaid eligibility, because as the program gets deeper and deeper implemented, inertia makes it very, very difficult to get sweeping changes. I think this is why the Obama administration offers the very generous matches that Mickey alluded to. I mean, 100% match for 3 years, then whittling down to a 90% match over the next 10 years. I mean, the idea is to get as much of the program implemented as fast as possible, because then inertia is very difficult in order to make sweeping changes to the program. And what you end up is a program that matches as closely as possible the ideals that you have. We were talking to some folks at the Oklahoma City University Law School just this morning about changes to the healthcare system, and they were saying that, who knows? Nobody knows. So there's so many rules that have yet to be written. There are so many things that have yet to take place that it's really difficult to know, for me, on any one specific thing or more broadly, what the healthcare system will look like 20 years from now, what impacts that will have, because there's so much that still remains to be seen as rules get written, things get implemented slowly, incremental changes, and what ultimately happens there.
There are a number of different tax changes as a result of the Affordable Care Act. One of them is one that no one really calls a tax except for the Supreme Court, and that's the individual mandate, which is something I actually support because, one, it's an idea that was first espoused by an organization called the Heritage Foundation a couple of decades ago. And the reason for the individual mandate, the requirement that people buy health insurance, is that in 2010, there were $60 billion of what's called uncompensated care costs in the U.S. Those are costs mostly created by uninsured individuals who go out and consume health care. I have health insurance, and by golly, I pay a lot for it each month for my wife and family. And when I go to the emergency room, I get covered, and insurance pays part of my bill, and I pay part of my bill, and go on. An uninsured person walks in right after me, they get covered too, but usually those bills go unpaid. $60 billion of those in 2010. Without the Affordable Care Act, those were projected to rise by 2020 to $125 billion annually in uncompensated care costs. And what those uncompensated care costs do is they decrease the revenues to providers, so providers have to charge more to everybody else. I mean, we have to pay more for government programs like Medicaid and Medicare because healthcare costs are higher. We have to pay more on our health insurance because our healthcare costs are higher. And so those uncompensated care costs are shifted. They're not gone. They're shifted onto providers, onto taxpayers, and onto the insured population. By requiring people to purchase health insurance, then what happens is those uncompensated care costs are expected to fall below $40 billion, 1/3 of what they would have been by 2020. And so the requirement to purchase health insurance really does keep the costs from falling on taxpayers, to keep the costs from falling on providers and the insured population. The other cost, I think, is one that's much more significant. It's one that's affecting businesses. If I could go back, and I was a person who supported the Affordable Care Act because I saw it as progress, certainly not perfection. But to me, perhaps the most damaging thing about the Affordable Care Act is the requirement that employers provide health insurance, because I think the impact on employers is quite significant here. I pay, my employer at the University of Central Oklahoma pays a portion of my health insurance premiums, the state of Oklahoma does. But the economic research really shows that when employers pay health insurance, it really is paid by the employees in the form of lower wages. And so that cost actually gets passed on in the form of lower wages, part of the total compensation package. We're requiring employers to pick up this tab, and it's affecting their cost structure and their decisions, their willingness to hire and employ people. And so that requirement on many businesses that they have to offer health insurance, I think, is a significant tax that I hope that Congress revisits, instead of repealing it, fixing that part of it to make it more amenable to businesses.
Is this working? Yeah? Okay, thank you. Dr. Hepner, you had mentioned some of the new entitlements you'd like to see come into Oklahoma with Obamacare and the governor turning it down. But recently I read an article this week that suggested that if the federal government was run like a private business and accrued its entitlement expenses as a private business must, its liabilities, that the real debt is about $67 trillion. And in order to keep from going further downhill, we would have to recognize liabilities this year or next year of $8 trillion. In order to keep from going further downhill, we would have to tax at 100% all incomes above $62,000 in the United States, as well as all corporate profits. And I hear you speaking as to the needs of society, but isn't it a need of society not to engage in Ponzi schemes and tulip bulb type activities that will inevitably lead to disaster?
Now, I warned you this was going to come back.
I think that's a wonderful question, and I'm really glad you asked, because you raised some incredibly important points there that we do need to address. The first thing, though, I think it's important to note that the Affordable Care Act doesn't add to our debt. The Congressional Budget Office actually finds that it reduces the debt over the next 10 years, reduces it by even more on the 10 years after that. But the entitlement, those are the real problem. And if we think about the sustainability of our fiscal picture right now, it's what's going on, not right now, not the debt that we have this year, but the debt that's coming in the next 5 to 10 years, because we have promised benefits for a long time that we just can't afford to pay. And we must address those issues, because we are passing that burden on to my kids. I have 2 young kids at home, and they mean everything to me. And we are burdening them with promises that they never agreed to, and 2, promises they're not reasonably going to be able to pay. And so, as I mentioned earlier, when we look at solving the big problems, we have some big problems we face, and you mentioned those right now. The entitlements, the promises we have made well into the future, are problems that we face. We can't solve those by one party acting alone. We can't solve those by one party saying no. It's time for us to come together and recognize that we have big problems that we face. It's going to require big, bold solutions, and more importantly, it's going to require us to be together and recognize and be willing to make those tough choices. So thank you for the question, and hopefully our members of Congress will also start thinking about those next 20 and 30 years more so than that next election.
Well said. One more question?
Right here. You've mentioned a 25% reduction in the state income tax. What impact has that had on the state revenues? Did they go up, did they go down, or did they remain the same?
Well, state tax revenues go up every year. So the question you always have to ask yourselves is, what is the impact of the tax change on revenues? And this is what we try to do as economists, to try to untangle that, which means you have to untangle the effects of everything else going on in the economy. So usually a change that we've had, any one-time change that's kind of a 0.25 percentage points or anything, that's going to be pretty hard to find in the data. Also, I would argue that if you look at the 90s versus post-2000 in Oklahoma, and we lowered all these rates and we went to right-to-work state and we did all these things, it was hard for me to see in the data that those things mattered a lot. And that doesn't mean it didn't matter. It just means given everything else going on in the economy, all the other different trends, it's not easy to see those things sticking out. And this is obviously for us academics, this is one of those issues that has been studied infinitely. There's just a ton of academic studies on this. And if you do what we call meta-analysis, which is you say, well, we have so many studies, widely different approaches, widely different results. Let's take sort of the average. What's sort of the average under various conditions, and the way we look at this, they find that the personal income tax has a small negative effect on economic activity, on average. So at the margin, if you can find efficiencies, gains in government, or you can close some tax credits, or you can find some things that are just inefficient, and then combine that with a lower income tax rate, you can, on the margin, get some gain. What it's not the silver bullet. You don't get rid of it and everything's fine. You know, you don't have to worry about expenditures. So these things are always at the margin, and I think most of us think that what you need is good government who provide the best services at the lowest possible price for the citizens. And when you do that, you're going to maximize your economic welfare. It's not as simple as just grabbing one lever and pulling it and said, there, we're done. It takes more effort than that. At least that's my view from those of us who've done studies on that.
I think you get to hate one tax at a time, and certainly states, we hate the property tax in this state. We only raise somewhere on the order of 40% on a comparative basis the size of the economy that Texas raises with its property tax. But I, for one, think that we should be doing more with the property tax. We control centrally with state government what local areas can do with the property tax, and we should be freeing up local areas that they want to collect more in taxes in order to have a better school system. We should allow more local autonomy in terms of taxes and let them sell it locally. Here's what we want the money, like the MAPS program was sold to this community. Here's what we want the money for. Here's what we're going to do with it. If localities want to do that, instead what we do is we punish them at the state level. If you earn more money, have more revenue from the property tax, we reduce what you get from the state. I mean, we just have absolutely arcane kind of procedures because we want this centralized control of what local governments spend. As a consequence, local governments are all concerned with what retail establishments can we get, not what manufacturing can we attract to the area, because if local governments depend on the sales tax for their operational budgets. And so we need more local freedom. When we do that, then we can talk about, well, maybe we can go to less state support for K through 12 education. We can realign things and we can adjust our tax base in that way. Allow local freedom. Allow local choice.
Okay, I know there are more questions, but we're well past our time, and I'm getting the signal. So, first of all, let's thank our panel. Well done, guys. Second of all, you all enjoy your lunch, and we'll resume the program again shortly.